Well, dear Eric, I can't express how happy I am for this occasion. I mean, for the first book of yours to be translated into Slovene. We have been discussing this over years about the possible translation of your book, and finally, here it is. So this is a very happy occasion. We have been collaborating for a very long time, and I'm particularly proud and happy that this book of yours finally appeared in Slovene. I must somehow briefly, nevertheless, have a look at your career, and it's a long career. It actually presents an oeuvre. I think there is a plot running through all your books. Ultimately, there's a common plot.
QAnon.
QAnon, exactly. Well, QAnon. There's a conspiracy. There's conspiracy behind this. And actually, it's an oeuvre. I mean, it has been recognized as such, and I think next year in Munich, there will be actually a conference dedicated to your work, organized by Dominic Finkelde. High time. And your career somehow, through the titles of your books, your career can be encompassed. The first book was Friedrich Hölderlin, Narrative Vigilance and the Poetic Imagination in 1986, which was the subject of your PhD. And then there is Stranded Objects, Mourning, Memory and Film in Post-War Germany in 1990. And then comes My Own Private Germany, Daniel Paul Schreber's Secret History of Modernity in 1996. And here I stop. This is actually the first book of yours that I read, and this is the book over which we actually met.
Yeah.
And we met in Princeton, and I reconstructed today, this was in 1995. And by sheer coincidence, I was at that time editing a book on Schreber in Slovene. There was a first translation also of Freud's analysis of Schreber and Lacan, etc., a number of pieces. And over the conversation, I mentioned this, and he said, but I just have a whole manuscript on this, on the Schreber case. I said, but could you possibly, send me this? And so you did. So I read this and immediately decided, the book was always going to print, but I immediately decided that we must have 2 chapters from your book in the Slovene publication, the collection. And so it happened that the Slovene publication appeared in 1995, 1 year ahead. The 2 chapters appeared 1 year ahead of the English publication. And this is how we met, 27 years ago, and then we collaborated somehow ever since in various frameworks, in various occasions. And it's a great book. It's seriously the best book on Schreber. This is the standard of all Schreber studies. Then comes on the psychotheology of everyday life, reflections on Freud and Rosenzweig in 2001, which I think is one of the best introductions to what maybe psychoanalysis is all about. I'll come back to this. I come to a particular quote in that book that I particularly like. Then there is Catastrophe and Meaning, which is the Holocaust in the 20th century, which is a collected volume you edited together with Moïse Postin. And then comes The Neighbor, 3 Inquiries in the Political Theology in 2005 with Slavoj Žižek and Kenneth Reinhardt. And if I remember well, this was the first time you were in Ljubljana. It must have been at that time, because the talk you presented then was entitled On Neighbors and Other Creatures, I think. It was a highly successful talk, very memorable. 2005 maybe. And then you were in Ljubljana a number of times since then. Then it's On Creaturely Life, Rilke, Benjamin and Sebald in 2006. Then The Royal Remains, The People's Two Bodies and the Endgames of Sovereignty in 2011. And we'll come back to this particular book, because it's like the immediate precedent of the thing which is translated in Slovene. Then comes The Weight of All Flesh, on the subject matter of political economy, which were the stuff of your Berkeley tenor lectures published in 2016, and which give some sort of, the 2 lectures, the extensive lectures, give some sort of summary of your stance or what of your agenda. And this is why we decided that for the Slovene book, it's actually best to start with this. That this gives the best introduction into your work. And then comes Sovereignty Incorporated, a trio book together with William Mazzarella and Aaron Schuster in 2020. So your part, 1/3 of the book, is then forms the second part of this Slovene translation. So the Slovene translation is composed of 2 of your works, which actually, I think, give the best overview of the current state of your research. I mean, these 2 things taken together. Because Sovereignty Incorporated also brings the whole story of the sovereignty of people's 2 bodies, etc., to the present time and to the particular problem, which has this strange one-syllable name of Trump. And then after that there is the last book, which is Untying Things Together, Philosophy, Literature and Life in Theory, which was just published in 2022, which is your sort of intellectual history, an overview of intellectual history.
Kind of my confessions.
And yeah, it's sort of like Augustine's confessions, or Rousseau's confessions, yeah. Maybe the third part, yeah. The continuation of this sort of line. So this gives already an impression of the scope, of the enormous scope of your oeuvre. And so it was high time for this Slovene translation. I think it will, again, present a standard, make its impact. And we didn't particularly prepare for this. Yes, as has been already mentioned, this was translated by Simon Hajdini and Lidija Šumah, who are there, and maybe they will want to say something eventually.
Perhaps just one thing, you know, how you here in Hollywood, you had me at hello. I would say, when I read, you know, what was the title again of the weight of all flesh on the subject matter of political economy. You had me at the economy.
Well, we didn't particularly prepare for this because we have been co-teaching actually a lot at the University of Chicago. And this is the way we did our seminars. We never consulted. Everybody prepared his own thing, and then it always magically came together. Somehow it so happened that it added up. And this is the way we'll do our seminar. Yeah. We'll do our seminar here. This is the way we usually do the seminar. Everybody prepares something, and I'm sure it will add up. So I don't know. The first thing I would, I mean, this is not. I'm here basically only in the role to launch bullet points or questions. So it's for you to actually present the thing, the work. So the first simple question would be: the Slovene title of this book is "Political Economy of the Flesh," because the weight of all flesh, which is an excellent English title. I mean, but this is a pun. And we come to the question of punning. You're the master. You're really the master of punning. You're the best. You have developed punning to the high art. The high, and this is not. It doesn't mean that punning as joking, but punning as a serious theoretical work. I mean, the work of puns that must be considered at some point. I would ask you about the mystery of this title. I mean, the title is a bit puzzling, and as Urban just told me, when Goethe-Institut wanted to make publicity on Facebook for this event, they were actually prevented because political economy of the flesh, that seemed fishy. That seemed like, is this a kind of code word for...
Flesh, not fish.
Oh, flesh, flashy. It seemed flashy. It seemed too flashy as a title. It seemed like it might be a code word for pornography or something. God knows what flash do these people have in mind. So there was no Facebook publicity for this event. And let's start with this notion of the flesh and the political economy of the flesh, and like the simple question: what is flesh, which, well, in what way flesh differs from the physical body? Why is this something completely different? What completely different? Different, well, attached to the physical body, but nevertheless different. So this would be my first simple question. Explain the title.
Explain your title. First, I want to thank the Goethe-Institut. Ich bedanke mich sehr, dass Sie mich hierher eingeladen haben. And I want to thank Mladen for being here, and I want to say hi to, I have a number of friends in the audience, some I haven't seen in quite a long time, and it's very good to see you. And I want to express my deep gratitude to Simon and Lidija for translating this. I have to say, I don't know how good their Slovene is. But I've rarely met two non-native speakers of American English who have so mastered idiomatic American English that it sometimes embarrasses me. Oh, that's how you say it? Okay, got it, yeah. So I feel very honored to have had the two of them to translate this book. The title, so the English title, The Weight of All Flesh. I mean, I don't know if any of you watched any of the funeral ceremony for Queen Elizabeth. I mean, we actually watched the fair. At various points, there was discussion of how heavy the crown was, the weight of the crown. I forget exactly, how many kilos, but it's quite heavy. And so there's something about, and it's clearly the weightiness of the crown is more than something that you could, measure with a scale. So there's clearly something about sovereignty that has a kind of, it's not just gravitas, it's a kind of weightiness. And the question is, what is weighed there? And what got me going on the idea of flesh and the weight of flesh, there were several things. First, it was Ernst Kantorovic's 1957 book, The King's Two Bodies, the study of medieval political theology. And there he basically just elaborates this notion, this fiction, this admitted fiction and yet necessary fiction that ran through the late Middle Ages and early modernity, that the king harbored it didn't just have a physical body, but had another body that was the incarnation of the legitimacy of the crown. And that so the person of the king was thought to be a double of some kind. And it was also, Kantorovich talked about the many ceremonies, in great detail and the way they changed, how this, in a way, how the second body was liturgically, ceremonially sustained through acclamations, through various rites at the court. And the crucial thought behind it was that that during succession, royal succession, the second body would find a new home in the body of the new monarch. So we might say that Charles just put on a little weight. But he didn't put on body, he put on flesh. And the question is, does he really have it? And it remains to be seen whether he can flesh out the flesh through his activity, through his behavior, the way he inhabits his office as king. At any rate, so I was thinking that a lot about, well, okay, does this flesh, the second body, then just disappear with the emergence of popular sovereignty when there's no longer a royal body, a Staatsperson, to be the bearer of this stuff, that's not measurable yet weighty. And actually, there's just a quote I'd like to read from Kantorovich. The book he wrote before The King's Two Bodies, already in the late 40s, was about about laudes, about acclamations, royal acclamations performed at coronations. And he of course, he had been, you know, a right-wing political activist after World War I. He was, I think, part of a Freikorps even, and had he been allowed to, you know, be a Nazi, he probably would have been a Nazi, but then he emigrated to the United States. But he lived through the resurgence of acclamations, the most famous, you know, Heil Hitler, and the importance of the praise, the production, the way that praise, these acclamations, in a certain sense, enter into, are transmitted to the person of the leader and amplify the body of the leader, and somehow help to guarantee legitimacy through a kind of materiality, not simply symbolic, okay, we know it's a fiction. In a way, it's stronger than a fiction. And this is kind of the issue. And this is also, this makes the link to psychoanalysis. Because psychoanalysis is also not simply about the stories we tell ourselves, fictions, lies we tell about ourselves, but somehow the way these things get incarnated, become in a way somatic, but not exactly somatic. And the problem is, what is the right word for this thing that's neither simply within the realm of meaning, a story, a fiction, or images, but neither simply somatic. So this is, I use the word flesh, and I try to show in my work that Freud arrives on the scene as a scientist of the flesh. And Merleau-Ponty actually called, who had his own, you know, writings about the flesh of the world, called Freud the only philosopher of the flesh. That Freud arrived on the scene at the point at which the transmission of the king's two bodies into the people, as the new bearer of sovereignty, was no longer working, and as it were, was spilling over, and no longer containable, and was became manifest more as agitation symptoms, you know, basically the kinds of things that Freud then analyzed in the clinic. But to go back to Kantorovich, he says, the Laudi's acclamation, representing the recognition of the king's legitimacy, was an accessory manifestation, impressive by its festal and solemn character, but not indispensable, for legally, the liturgical action added no new element of material power, which the king had not already received earlier by his election and coronation. By means of this chant, and he's talking about the coronation of Charlemagne, the church professed and publicly espoused the king in a solemn form. However, the weight of this profession or espousal cannot be measured by legal standards. So it was indispensable, but it was not indispensable, but was somehow necessary. And it couldn't be measured. Another way of putting this dimension that amplifies the body of the king and enters into the king, as it were, by the voice, the collective voice of the people, and gets, you know, through the alchemy of coronation, you know, becomes part of the body. I lost my train of thought. Another way of putting it, a book that was also influential for me was Agamben's book, which in English is called The Kingdom and the Glory, an archaeology of glory. In German, it's Herrschaft und Herrlichkeit. So rule and glory. And at some level, the argument is that there's no Herrschaft, no reign, without Herrlichkeit. So we need this dimension, you know, we talk about it now more in terms of charisma, you know, what makes a leader, the leader beyond, you know, clearly, you know, what amplifies them and helps sustain the transference of people to them, the fantasy, you know, the phantasmatic dimension of the relation to the sovereign. At any rate, I worked through this issue of the shift from royal sovereignty to popular sovereignty, really by way of the study of Freud and various literary texts. And I should also say through Foucault. I'll say something about that. Maybe I'll say it, but I'll say it now. Foucault, the normal story of Foucault's genealogy of governmentality is we had the centralization, classical sovereignty. The principle of sovereignty is located in the king, and power then shifts to other locuses, expert knowledge, management, administration, and these other locations of power were charged with disciplining the body and administering populations. And so we have biopowers is the crucial word. And my thought is that what Foucault was tracking in this shift is not simply what calls forth biopower, expert knowledge, is not just that the population needs to be governed, but that the population now is the bearer of another dimension of life, another kind of vitality that had previously been managed in the court, in the ceremonies of the court, but now had to be administered. And my argument is that this is more than simply disciplining bodies in the sense of making people behave in certain ways, of statistical analysis of health and disease and death rates, but it's really a preoccupation with the new locus of sovereignty, the people. And I think it was really only Freud. I don't think Foucault really grasped this. I think he was onto it, and there are many indications that he was. I won't quote, but some of his formulations about the object of biopower suggest that he's talking about something with, let's say, metaphysical dimensions, theological niceties, as Marx would say about commodities. So the idea is that the people now bear something that's not simply legal, that's not simply, that requires new kinds of knowledge and new kinds of expertise to sustain it, to maintain it in its functionality, its operativity. And the next, what leads to the title, the political economy of the flesh, is the thought that what happens at the same time as the displacement of the monarch by the people, the shift from royal to popular sovereignty, is the rise of political economy as the crucial feature of the management of states. That is part of, I think, what Foucault misses early on, but then captures in later work in the lectures on biopolitics, which end up being lectures on liberalism and neoliberalism, was the realization that biopower is that dimension of sovereignty that called forth biopower is now circulating in the economy, and that governmentality is really happening. That is, we are governed in our lives by really more by economic activity, economic phenomena than the political. So in a certain sense, the political theology of the sovereign becomes the political theory of popular sovereignty, becomes the political economy of the flesh. And what is happening is a mutation of a dimension that belongs to, let's say, the operation of legitimacy and the social bonds of people with respect to some sort of institutional authority. And so the book tracks this shift from the sovereign to the people to, in a sense, the commodity, where it's no longer the king, you say, who has two bodies, it's the thing that has two bodies. It has, use value and it has exchange value. And what capitalism is ultimately about, as in Marx's view, is the self-valorization of value, ever more value, which is very close to the formulations of Max Weber talking about the glorification, about labor as the glorification of God. That is, in Max Weber, in The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, Weber argued that the spirit of capitalism, what made capitalism was that something was injected into it that had nothing to do with purposeful activity or interest, or individual interest. It was about glorification, about the production and amplification of God's glory, ad majorem Dei gloria. And everyday life, work, became the process, a kind of liturgical activity, a doxology of everyday life, whereby this, this strange substance, glory, doxa, would be produced, more and more of it. And what Marx basically does is, argues is that the spirit of capitalism is just value itself, that is valorizing itself, and the rest of us are officiants. We serve the way the members of the court serve the king to amplify and sustain the two bodies of the king. We now are officiants of value, of the self-amplification, self-valorization of value. And so our activities, as our working activities, our purposeful activities, also have this double aspect. We engage in purposeful labor, but we are also always producing, producing a surplus labor that is about more of this stuff value, which Marx himself called eine gespenstige Gegenständlichkeit, a spectral objectivity. And my genealogy links the spectral objectivity from the king's sublime body to the object of biopower, to now the political economy of this spectral substance, which I'm calling the flesh. Yeah.
This was perfect, sort of. Really, yeah.
So that's the title.
Now let's come to the subject matter.
The subject, right.
The subject
the
matter.
Subtitle.
No, I will only add to this. No, okay. When reading your books, one is always on a roller coaster.
Yeah.
Because so many things get somehow from various quarters together into a pattern and into a story, into a narrative, just as you did now.
That's what I'm calling untying things together.
Yeah, untying things together, precisely. I will just perhaps add, you have a very useful formulation you use in the Royal Remains and also there later, which I found extremely useful, that you describe this history of sovereignty, this transformation, the shift in sovereignty. Sovereignty before was, in pre-modern times, was based in transcendence, basically. And then, supposedly, with modernity, all transcendence was relegated to immanence. But what happened then, and this is the most useful formulation, is the surplus of immanence. I really love this formula. I think it's extremely useful. It's very shorthand for so many things. What happened is it's not a new transcendence. There's just a surplus of immanence, which is an additional pressure, a surplus pressure.
Yeah.
we are somehow constantly. This is, I think, an excellent diagnosis of what happened. And I will just comment briefly on Marx, and then you can perhaps, continue, whatever, the story. One of Marx's most famous pronouncements from Communist Manifesto is alles ständig und stehende verdammt, alles Heilige wird entweiht. Everything solid melts into thin air, and everything sacred is being desecrated, is being profaned. So this is the effect of capitalism, and Marx first describes the effect of capitalism as profanation. Now, everything that used to be sacred before is now profaned. But then, we can come perhaps to this mysterious short piece by Walter Benjamin, who says capitalism as religion. So Marx says religion is gone. I mean, everything is desecrated, but nevertheless we have capitalism as religion. I mean, Marx himself then describes the commodity, as I already said, a very common thing, but which the moment you look at it, there are all these metaphysical niceties and theological quirks, theologische Mucken. So there is a theology, there's a sort of materialized theology surviving in a way in this commodity world. And this is where all this comes in, all those problems you described come in. I mean, the problem of doxology, the cult, the permanent cult, sans trêve, sans merci, without respite, without mercy. All the time we have to subscribe, we have to practice this cult.
Business.
Business. What do you call the business?
That we're busybodies.
So you have this double thing. Religion is gone, but religion has survived. I mean, it has survived precisely in this most common zero, empty religion, as it were. The sacred is gone, but there is this empty form of sacredness which survives in the commodity itself. And this is perhaps acute to Benjamin, which is another of your extremely important authors.
So, I mean, for Benjamin, it was what Weber's argument was insufficient, that capitalism really gets going only by being injected with a religious dimension, so that one worked no longer simply for self-interest, but for something else, for the Protestant saints, for the greater glory of God. For Benjamin, it's not just that the purposeful activity was amplified; the activity itself was fully cultic. So there was no outside. So in a certain sense, there was no longer a distinction between the sacred and the profane. And it's interesting that another important figure for me is Emil Durkheim. And his book, The Elementary Forms of Religious Life. And he argues that in the Australian tribes that he studied, and of course he didn't go to Australia, he was reading ethnographic material, by missionaries and amateurs, but he's developed nonetheless a very profound sociological theory about social bonds. But he argued that the distinction between the profane and the sacred was very clear in these societies. And he said the problem in modernity that has become blurred, which is a strange thought, because you think it's just gone, it's just secular life, and you go to church. But he actually recognized that there's some, inmixing of, that there really is no separate realm of religion. That it is just the very way in which we're constantly busy, as it were, online, on call, is what Max Weber, thought of as a calling, a religious calling, Berufsarbeit, being berufen, being called. And what Benjamin said is that we are always being called. There's no not being called. In a way, the demand, and it's interesting, Freud called the drive eine Arbeitsanforderung, a demand for work. And what Benjamin is effectively saying is, yes, but the demand is coming from let's say, the drive representations are of capital in us. Let's say value demanding, to become amplified, the self-valorization. But it's a constant, a continuously emanating demand for work. And the question is, work for what? And it's clearly not just purposeful work. It's really about being busy, which is in a certain kind of testimony, a witnessing that you are on call, that you are online, that you are being, fully socially mediated, as it were. And so all of life for Benjamin that's why it's not capitalism and religion, or it's capitalism as religion. He has also quite a bit to say about debt, the place of debt, the way in which an unpayable debt has become incorporated into our very being. It's something actually that I talk a bit about The Merchant of Venice in the book, and there I rely on Mladen's reading of the idea of mercy in The Merchant of Venice, which is a kind of an eternal, unpayable debt that becomes just, in a way, becomes constitutive of our being. And this is basically what Benjamin argues in capitalism. So it's a religion that's not about the expiation of debt, but rather the amplification of debt, which is very close to the way Freud tried to grasp the dynamics of the superego. So there's clearly something, a relationship between what Freud was working through with the concept of the superego, the surplus ego. Let's say we don't just have an ego, we have another ego, a second ego, that always needs more, needs to be nourished, needs more food, that is more work, needs you to be busier, to produce what? More superego, more surplus. Benjamin thought that Kafka's work was suffused with this, let's say, this kind of cultic atmosphere, which I think is also why he was nervous about Gershom Scholem's, let's say, overly theological reading of Kafka's work, and his was more a political economic reading of the pressure under which Kafka's figures live. I often quote this one little aphorism that Kafka wrote in 1913, 1914. And he says, about the king and the man. It simply begins, they were asked whether they wanted to be, children were asked whether they wanted to be kings or messengers, but because there are no more kings, they all became messengers, and now the messengers run around madly, yelling meaningless, pronouncements. They'd like to stop doing it, but they can't because of the oath of office they've taken. So the idea, in a certain sense, they're condemned to kind of pure busyness, pure social mediation, online all the time, as it were, meaningless, and they can't stop because of their Diensteid, their oath of office. And so the question becomes, where are we taking this oath? Where have we avowed? And can one renounce the oath? And the question, we never, swear the oath, and yet we live as if we're bound by some sort of oath of office. We inhabit an office, ein Amt. And that's why I call Kafka's writings trauamtliche Schriften. Traum has the word dream, trauma, and amtlich. bureaucratic office writings. So it's basically this, we're constantly at work, meaning in the office. And another aspect where Benjamin and Kafka join is the idea that the office is everywhere. And we know that in the so-called gig economy, as soon as you have a phone, the office is everywhere. And what Benjamin tried to grasp at in the sense of this absolute cult, and Kafka tried to grasp it in the sense of just the bleeding together of the office and the bedroom, as in the castle. So, and we don't make the distinction here between office and bed. So there's so in a certain sense, all of it. The question. So the problem is, what is the is there anything to do, or is it? And this is why there's a in the Gambin's work, and not just in the Gambin's work, there's often the a kind of the temptation to grasp to Bartleby the Scrivener as the solution. I prefer not to. So some way of going on strike, or Benjamin's idea of the general strike, from Sorel. Some way in which we somehow have to pull the emergency brake on this busyness. Exit the cult. Be deprogram. And I honestly have found I don't find the Gambins, the more gestures toward what this might be like. I don't think Benjamin really had a clear sense of how to exit that cult. I don't think his Marxism was strong enough to make him believe truly in revolutionary activity, which he thought of as what the general strike is about.
Pure violence.
Yeah, pure divine violence.
Divine violence.
That would intervene into this repetition compulsion of which is now not simply about political power, but about the economic machine, the machine of capitalism. So this is in a way, where I also, to some extent, throw up my hands and say, I don't know, but I have to say myself, I understand the temptation to a certain quietism, to a certain gesture, for me, the talk I'm going to give, in a few days on Kafka's dog, ends up with some, reflections on poetry, on Celan's notion of Dichtung as opposed to Kunst, which he says, he says, it's a the poetic word, he calls it is a Gegenwort, a counter word that intervenes into, basically the machine of politics and economy. And he says the counterword offers, and he says the counterword, one name for it is poetry, and it opens up a space. It's a step toward freedom. And there, it sounds very much like the end of Kafka's dog story, or freedom, a wretched, freedom as is possible today, something sort of wretched, but nonetheless a possession. And I find that very unsatisfying, but that's as far as my, I don't know. So that's kind of where I find myself, always, sort of thinking of the working through, but not of sort of the life to come. The community to come, the coming community, that's.
Well, Kafka's dog story, finishes in the line, freedom is a wretched possession, but on the last page, actually, this dog found a new science, the science of freedom. And, you know, I argued in my book that this is psychoanalysis. This is exactly at the same time. And Freud was, unbeknownst of Kafka, laying down the foundations of psychoanalysis. He comes up with this idea of dog science, the canine science, the cynical science. I mean, cynical in the sense of the etymological word. Kinos is a dog. It's a doggy science. The doggy science. There is perhaps, there is poetry, there is this science of psychoanalysis. And, well, I would...
it's a shaggy dog story, though.
A shaggy dog story, okay.
Psychoanalysis. It just goes on.
Well, you have this beautiful formulation in the book on psychotheology of everyday life, which I use often in the class, because it's just again, a one-liner, a very effective one-liner, where you say... that what is special about psychoanalysis is that it attends to the constitutive too-muchness that characterizes the human psyche. There's too much. There's too much reality. There's more reality that our psyche can contain. There's a surplus of immanence. Exactly. And this goes so much, I mean, this is in opposition, it goes against the line is so often taken by, Deleuze, Guattari, Foucault, feminism, that psychoanalysis is basically about the lack. There is a sort of ontology of the lack, ontology of negativity. This is what constitutive desire, we lack something, this is constitutive of the subject, it's premised on the lack, and, well, castration is all about, well, lack. So, I find this counter argument, this counter slogan, so very helpful that it's about having something too much. There's too much response. It's not that people can't enjoy. They enjoy too much. This is the problem, but they don't enjoy the way they would want to. It enjoys in us at our expense, not the way we would like to, not the way we can control. So there is this question of too muchness. Maybe you want to say something about this, and there I have another. Okay.
So another pun. I'm sure. I mean, given how much Ljubljana is a kind of capital of Hegel studies, even though this is a different direction of Hegel studies, I'm sure many of you know Robert Brandon's work, who just wrote this massive book on Hegel, The Spirit of Trust. I've listened to his lectures on the book. I mean, hundreds of hours of lectures of Brandon. But what he tries to do in the Hegel book is elaborate through a reading of Hegel what he already argued in his book, his most famous book, Making It Explicit. And the Hegel book is really just another way he reads the phenomenology of spirit as various steps of making something implicit explicit, making it explicit. And what I want to say is that psychoanalysis is making it explicit. So it's making it explicit. It's the same word, actually, making it explicit, but capital I. And so it's unpacking, in a way, learning how to live with, discovering practices of this too muchness, rather than culpabilizing anyone for the suffering it produces, or for imagining determinate solutions for a constitutive dilemma. But this is, the problem is the constitutive dilemma doesn't exist outside of particular problems, determinate issues. And so it's a constant struggle to try to grasp whether the solutions you're elaborating are solutions for, are whether you're trying to in a certain sense, get rid of it. Not get rid of it, this determinate thing, but get rid of it. And in a certain sense, psychoanalysis helps to in a way, sich vortasten, to kind of find your way through those, and help separate out those dimensions, and maybe give some orientation, a different kind of orientation for the way we work on determinate social, individual, political problems. The way they're in touch with constitutive impossibilities of living. Anyway, that's but psychoanalysis. I put this. In a way, the emergence of psychoanalysis is in a way of, in a certain sense, giving us, new practices, new ways of listening for, new ways of attending to. But I don't think attending to this dimension, but not. But it just gets you so far, I think. And so I think that I've become much more, more and more interested in other kinds of, theoretical projects. I've been listening a lot, for example, to people like Fred Moten, who's works in the sort of radical black theory tradition, and is also a poet. There's something, and there's something there. I'm looking for other resources, let's say, because I find that as much as psychoanalysis attunes me to the dimension, what I think is the crucial dimension, I don't know that it offers that much more to than this kind of looking awry, as it were, and seeing something there that is otherwise just an oppressive stain. So it's a problem for me.
Yes, I have another question about explaining your titles. The title of one chapter is towards a critique of monotheism.
Yeah.
And then you make a series of puns on management, etc., manufacture, first, what is monotheism? It's implicitly already in what you said, but also sort of side question. The question of punning is this: you use a lot of puns, do you see this as a conceptual work? Because I do.
Yes.
And I was giving a lecture this summer on the question of puns in psychoanalysis and homonymies, etc., etc., and somehow invented on the spur of the moment the conceptual power of concept and concept. They're concepts and concepts. They're concepts which are based on puns, basically, because concepts are supposed to be universal and abstract, and disentangled from the matter of language, for what Lacan called the contingencies of language, homonymies, and puns are precisely what uses those homonymies in order to make conceptual work. And then I was kind of proud of this, and I typed this into Google, and it turns out that everything has already been invented. There's somebody called Gregory Ulmer, maybe you know him.
Yeah.
He's a Derridian, who already invented this concept of concept. But maybe it's a useful tool, concepts. So monotheism, manufacture, management are kind of concepts, which do a lot of conceptual work. So what is the connection between the abstraction and universality of concepts and this particular?
Well, first about mana. So at first, at least in the United States, I always have to, when I talk about this, I always have to say it's not manna from heaven in the Bible. It's this Melanesian word that was imported into Europe in the 19th century by a missionary and ethnologist, Robert Codrington, and according to him, and then according to basically what it was taken up in the anthropological and cultural anthropology and comparative religions, it became the name for what they believe in. You know, for basically the special stuff, the virtual, the virtual power invested in objects that have basically it's the sacred dimension of objects that make them truly what they are, effectively what they are. So a thing is not just a thing because it's a thing, but it's invested with a special power that sustains it as the thing that it is. Now, I think we have this idea and the notion of creation. You know, I mean, understanding the world as created is understanding that what makes things things is they're, in a way, still being created. That is being invested with a dimension that isn't just immanent. And to be observant of things. You could only be truly observant of things if you're, to some extent, religiously observant. Now, what this word mana then comes to be used in, for maybe 30, 40 years in the social science literature, again, to name this dimension of what's in the thing that's more than the thing. And Marx also used a term from so-called primitive cultures, the fetish. And so we have these two terms that become very popular, very useful, as kind of terms used in cultural analysis, but typically cultural analysis of others, of primitives. And what Marx does is say, no, it's actually the term that captures the deeply religious dimension of capitalism. That is the belief that there's this special stuff in this thing that is not just usefulness, but also value. And anyway, so I just became attracted to this word mana as the name of the thing, not that's there, the stuff that's there, and then realize that one can understand Marx's labor theory of value as a theory of manufacture, not manufacture, that's with the hand, but the production of this special stuff. That is producing, it's okay, you have to produce things, but what you're really producing is value. That is, you're producing objects, but what you're really manufacturing is mana. So you're always doing two kinds of labor. Your labor is doubled, manufacturing and manufacturing. And so what that means, if we take seriously Benjamin's claim that capitalism is a kind of religion, so what would we call this religion? And I would say it's monotheism. That is, that we're officiants of a monotheistic cult of producing more and more mana, which has to be more and more managed. And we're all maniacal, so it basically just goes on and on. And suddenly, it's almost as if the proliferation of the pun has been contaminated. It's been contaminated by what it's naming. And for me, it's just by saying Marx's labor theory of value is a theory of manufacturing gives me a sense of the usefulness of the labor theory of value. That is, it's about something that economic theory can't fully grasp, because there's something incalculable about it, and the demand for its production is not based on rational interest, self-interest or otherwise. So we're part of this monotheistic cult, always producing more and more mana, manufacturing all the time. So I mean, the question whether the, okay, so that's about the particular word. Thinking, I mean, another word I use in the new book is, insist, to insist, E-N-C-Y-S-T, insist. So assist is like a growth, let's say, under the skin. Some of you have a cyst, there's fluid. And to insist something is to take something, some irritant from the world and take it in. And so insistence is a kind of like a pulsation of something that's been taken in from the outside and in some way, in some sense incorporated, but not fully incorporated. So it's like, and this is, we all know the pun ecstasy. So it's another way of getting at this, a double aspect of something that you can name with one word. And so it's a way of thinking that allows you to capture multiple dimensions of a thing and realizing that the thing is that thing only because of its multiple dimensions. That it's not that there's this thing that you add these other dimensions, additions, but somehow the thing turns out to be what it really is because it's untied together, these various strands. That is what it is. And so becoming observant of things through puns is, that's part of what I'm trying to say, that it's a way of becoming observant as, understanding the thing as the thing that it is. That you can't get it simply with a concept, you need the concept.
All right, I think we are approaching the end. I would nevertheless ask a question about, well, the immediate political constellation where this last book, the trio book, was written, which was the constellation of Trump's America. This is not a book about Trump, but nevertheless it turns around the question how this was possible. What changes? The title of the book is Sovereignty Incorporated. What changes in sovereignty? What shifts in sovereignty occurred that this thing became possible? And you start off your essay by the question of brand and branding, which somehow continues this question of monotheism, or the mana being incorporated, materialized in the brand, in the question of Trump actually being not so much a political agent or promoter of certain political ideas as a brand. It's a brand name and actually functions as such. And you speak about the homo economicus and homo politicus actually coming together under a single brand of Trump. This most pernicious development is really most worrisome thing that we still don't know how to counteract, because it actually caught the left completely unprepared.
Yeah, Trump was always confused when people asked him how he could continue running his business while also being the president. And he said, what's the problem? And he didn't understand that there was a separation. And it turns out that being president turned into a kind of enterprise. He was a kind of it's like the presidency was an enterprise, was a money-making enterprise. And we know just very concretely how he did it, through buying this hotel in Washington, D.C., and having dignitaries stay there, in trying to get the British government to have a major, golf event at his Scottish, so basically it's just one aspect of, it's just doing business.
Buying Greenland.
Yeah, buying Green,
merchandise.
And I think part of, the way in which, for him, things came together is, well, let me just put it this, the question is, once labor, many challenges to the labor theory of value have to do with transformations of labor, away from industrial labor, from, toward cognitive labor, different kinds of capital, surveillance capital, information capital, cognitive capital, and that whether these different things make gig economy, whether these things make the Marxist theory, the labor theory of value superfluous, that it got something right at a certain moment in the history of capitalism in the 19th century, but it's no longer the case. And so we need to just drop it. But in my view, by seeing the labor theory of value as a theory of manufacturing, that is the production of a kind of sublime virtual materiality, we haven't stopped doing it. And in fact, my argument is that the brand is the most refined form of mana, where in a certain sense it's just mana, it's just the word. So there's this wonderful passage, I think I'd have trouble finding it, from Don DeLillo's book White Noise, where the narrator listens to a child dreaming, saying the words Toyota, something, or Celica. Toyota Celica. And he then there's a beautiful passage where he talks about, in a way, the magic of these words, the force of these words that are now part of this child's brain and the social fabric. And in a way, it's like, in her book, No Logo, Naomi Klein interviews the head of Nike, then head of Nike, Peter Knight, I think his name is, who says he realized one day that Nike is not about manufacturing. We have to manufacture, but it's really about marketing. We're a marketing business. We're selling Nike. That is, we're selling the name, we're selling the brand. Okay, you have to make sneakers. It's, okay, it's the evil, okay, you have to, but it's really, he said it was like a revelation. He suddenly, and I want to say it is a revelation. He grasped what monotheism. He suddenly didn't know he was a monotheist, and then he became a professing monotheist. And then, became a representative in the corporate world of monotheism as the new direction, as what capitalism is really about. And I think Trump belongs to that world. And in fact, Trump at a certain point stopped actually making anything and just licensed his name. So somebody would build a hotel and would pay Trump to call it Trump Tower, or whatever. So it really it was like the pure brand. And yet for him, and I want to say this is when people respond to Trump, that is, the MAGA, and MAGA has also become a logo, a brand. It's on hats, it's like, it's really, no one really knows what it means anymore. It's now just a nonsense word, MAGA. MAGA Republicans, it's like MAGA, it's like MAGA maniacal, MAGA,
magic.
Yeah. And so it's, what I think it's a kind of brand loyalty. It's like they're taking part in the stuff that is somehow in the name, and clearly the body, this very grotesque body that has clearly too much flesh. And it's, and it's almost, it's like, it's a little like in Sieberberg's version of Parsifal has the wound, Amfortas's wound, separated from the body and is carried around in the ritual. And in a certain sense, Trump has said, "Oh, I'll have some of that," and he eats it, and now it's me, and so it's like he actually, he avows the flesh, and this makes it very problematic. He somehow performs his own grotesqueness, the surplus of immanence. That's me. There's too much of me. And somehow the clear, what is it that, and I think people participate, I think it's really a participation. Not that he represents my interest, but a participation in
the flesh.
In the flesh, in the Trump. You know, he used to sell steaks. He doesn't have to anymore. Because it's not about meat, it's about flesh.
The stakes are higher.
The stakes are higher, right. The stakes are higher with the flesh over steak. This is what I mean about this.
No, well, you know, Juliet on the balcony asked, so what's in the name? And then the new version is, what's in the brand?
What's in the brand?
What's in the brand? There's so much more in the brand than in the name. But this is a point at which I would like to nevertheless open the floor for discussion. And first of all, Simon and Lydia, you translated the book. Would you like to say something, add, comment, or whatever? I mean, no, don't feel obliged. Don't feel obliged.
So this was a long discussion. So I'm not sure I can sum it up. But one concept that I really enjoy and I find really valuable in thinking through, especially from the perspective of psychoanalysis, and I think that prior to this concept, there was actually a kind of a conceptual deadlock within our own, let's say, theories. And the concept solved it quite elegantly. And this concept is surplus scarcity. I absolutely love it because it addresses in such an elegant way the relationship between lack and surplus in analysis. And of course, I mean, you spoke about Trump just now. So his surplus is just a kind of excessive embodiment of a lack. That's what it is, I think. And then the second point, I really think that you're, I mean...
His niece wrote a book about him, Too Much, Never Enough. Perfect. So the other thing is that I wanted to say that I think, and it's a more general one, I think you're basically, well, one more thing about the precepts, because I actually heard you guys give a seminar twice. The entire thing twice. So I do realize that Mladen is over-prepared for some reason, although being a professor of professors, I don't know, he should spend his time with more productive things than preparing the lecture. You, on the other hand, perhaps this is like, okay, it's a small, okay. But I think that the only way for you to do it is to under-prepare. Right. So I think the combination of an over-prepared and an under-prepared something works well. But then on the subject of precepts, I remember, I mean, it really stuck with me. I listened to your seminar. This was your standalone thing that you did on Sebald, whom I didn't really admire or read, but somehow you have this capacity to make things that, to kind of make things appealing, even though even though they're not appealing.
And I remember distinctly, I don't know which exactly work it was it the Rings of Saturn? One of those things where he walks a lot. It's just like the whole thing is just the whole thing is just walking. And at a certain point, you were kind of trying to formulate your point, and meaning, really, like the sense of it, the entire thing dropped when you had this idea of a footnote, which of course had to do with the feet and the walking, nothing with the regular footnotes, but this was a use of the precept that kind of opened up a whole possibility of interpreting those texts. And then one last thing, I think that in essence you're a genealogical thinker. So I don't think you should be pressured too much by, what do we do now? Because whatever is to be done will have to be connected to whatever you're doing right now. So there's not a kind of an intrinsic idea of a break in your thought. You're not wired that way as a philosopher. So yeah.
Can I say just about,
thank you so much.
Yeah.
This was
a book that I've never been able to read. I've tried it maybe 30 times. It's The Man Without Qualities. Der Mann ohne Eigenschaften. I realize I've tried so many times, and this summer I decided I'd give it another try, and I'm actually getting into it. But I think what helped me get into it is a pun that sort of gave me an access to what I think is going on. One of the most famous concepts that associated with Musil and the book is Möglichkeitssinn. That is, it's about the idea that we have to develop a sense of possibility. And my thought was that what Freud added is that we need Möglichkeitssinnlichkeit, not just Möglichkeitssinn, but Möglichkeitssinnlichkeit. That is, that sexuality for Freud is also somehow an orbiting around the locus of new possibilities for living. So there's no Möglichkeitssinn simply in the space of Sinn, that is meaning. That we need, that Möglichkeitssinn only really gets going on the basis of a kind of Möglichkeitssinnlichkeit. And once I sort of said, okay, this is what I'm going to look for. This is kind of what I'm going to, this is attuning me to the book in a new way. I then started feeling kind of, okay, I'm getting to see what, why people think this book is so important. But honestly, the University of Chicago, my department, had a conference on Musil, and I, as a member of the department, I had to go, and at a certain point, people are giving questionnaires. I said, I don't get what you see in this guy. I just don't get it. It's boring. It's overly cerebral. There's no, what? I don't get it. Do you really? You want to spend your life reading this? I just was so tired of hearing this, of this, and now I kind of get it, So I feel like I have to write some apologies. But it's like, like that word that somehow, oh, now I know what's going on here. So you get a kind of orientation that you're now inside it. You're not outside it. And the inside is, it's not exactly simply a familiarity with the world, being with the world, but in a way a comfort with the particular kinds of illegibilities, the particular kinds of things that you that you can't just simply grasp, but you somehow have found a way to let them get under your skin, to live with, to enjoy them basically, rather than being hermeneutically frustrated. It becomes a hermeneutic adventure of the body.
Are there any more questions, comments? Gregor, as always.
Thank you. So, what Musil, I think, has is also an idea of historicity. And so I wanted also to press a little bit on your philosophy of history, so to speak. So, you talk about the transition from monarchical sovereignty to people's sovereignty. And if you think of a philosopher like Karl Marx, you could simply say, yes, of course, there has to be a revolution in order for that transition to happen. Specifically, French Revolution, let's say. So then, would you agree with that? I mean, does that also predict kind of like a possible future solution? Is that something that you would condone, like the idea of revolution? I mean, you have touched in your talk this a couple of times, the question how Benjamin sees it, and you've discussed the possibilities of psychoanalysis to bring something, to not just be a shaggy dog story, but to bring something to an end. So, yeah, I suppose that's my question.
I mean, there are obviously a number of things. A number of questions there. To go back to the Communist Manifesto, Marx said, capitalism only lives by constantly revolutionizing its modes of production. And so part of what a revolution would be an interruption of those revolutions, somehow, which I think is the pressure of monotheism. So the revolution would also have to be involved with some kind of suspension of a dimension we participate in without fully, in a way, grasping that we are participating in it. So it's, I don't think that, let's say, simply critique is sufficient. And I'm not sure, I mean, it raises all kinds of problems. When the process you're interrupting involves the dimension of the unconscious, let's say. The other thing, to go back to the French Revolution, I used on the cover of my book, The People's Two Bodies, The Royal Remains, Jacques David's
Marat's death.
The Death of Marat. And there I depended on the reading of the painting by, what's the name of the art historian? Yeah.
Clark.
T.J. Clark.
It's also in this book, reproduced.
So
this is the entry point.
Clark reads the painting. What he gets very interested in is the upper half of the painting, where it's just and he says it's not a background. It's a highly agitated field that has a kind of, I would say, it's a kind of geistige Körperlichkeit or körperliche Geistigkeit. It's a kind of spectral stuff, and it's as if the Marat, there's something about the revolution, what's released into the atmosphere, as it were, is in a way this dispersed virtual dimension of the flesh, and in a certain sense, becoming a bourgeois, un bourgeoisement, is in a certain sense finding your calling in the elaboration of this stuff, and the question of what being a bürger, a citizen, rather than being a bourgeois, how you can, in a certain sense, how you make that distinction. And I think that's, can you continue to be a citizen of a state without being a bourgeois, in the sense of participating in the elaboration of this, the substance of the spectral substance of value. And so I think that but again, what I think T.J. Clark, this goes back to, what psychoanalysis, what criticism, what philosophy, what reading allows you to do. It's suddenly, you see in this painting, suddenly an historical event that affects that injects into painting itself a new dimension, but also registers the injection into everyday life with a new dimension that we have to grasp, where in a way is genealogy, so that we know in a certain sense what we're coping with. And I'm not sure that, so let's say the revolution released something, and we could say it's like it released the stuff of where that becomes the stuff of crowdsourcing, of mass, crowdsourcing in the sense of this will have to be done together, but crowdsourcing is also about raising funds, about fundraising, about, there's an entrepreneurial dimension. And so, in a way, it's like the stuff of mass movement, Massenbewegung, so die Masse, and whether it could be a source, a crowd source, and that's a political question. And so I think, I haven't really answered the question about this. What the thoughts that your question raised for me. No, yeah, go ahead.
Well, it's just a little supplemental question, I suppose. In a sense, I wonder, would you oppose the idea that, like, in monotheism, there's some primordial way of that monotheism would be the primordial.
Mono.
Monotheism would be the primordial, the true way of how to deal with this surplus value or surplus belief or whatever. Whereas in monotheism, it would be kind of dispersed. Or would you say that monotheism is also just one historical version of managing?
No, I think, this is kind of what interested me about Rosenzweig, about Franz Rosenzweig. Was Rosenzweig is, I think he thought he was in part responding to what he saw as a kind of neo-paganism, which I think is another way of registering this kind of dispersed agitation. And he, in a certain sense, made the decision to become religiously observant, because I think I think he thought that the only way of living of finding orientation in all that agitation is through monotheism. That is through a kind of religious observance which involves also liturgical practice, which meant also, in a certain sense, seizing back, as it were, the liturgical life from monotheism and sort of reappropriating it. But I don't think that meant for him simply just putting it back in a separate sphere. It became for him a kind of a way of becoming ethically observant and potentially politically observant, though he wasn't especially politically observant. But that is that what it is that the kind of liturgical practice and modes of reading, interpretation that he taught and promoted it needed a new pedagogy. So he helped start a new kind of school, das jüdische Lehrhaus. So new ways of reading, he tried to, he retranslated the Bible with Buber. So the work of translation, the work of of basically learning, the tradition, engaging with the tradition, liturgical practice, but also pedagogy in which non-experts would teach. So it wasn't about the transmission of knowledge. But he felt the need to invent new practices, not simply go to synagogue or become kosher. So there was something actually revolutionary, I think, for him in rethinking everyday life. And in fact, the end of his book, The Star of Redemption, is ins Leben, into life, into the midst of life, but with a new capacity for observance, and observation.
Yuval.
So it's really great that I got related, because my pertains to what you just ended with, this sort of a happy accident. So I think another dimension of what I would call your observance, your way of being in language, aside from the past, it's akin to it, is this way of paying attention to what is lost in prose, so to speak. Just what you did right now. You take this in the midst of life, which is just something a throwaway expression, and you sort of listen to it, you give it its full, sort of fleshed out weight. I think that's part of what you do, part of your conceptual work. And with that, I sort of rejoin something that Simon said, that in that sense, we might trace within the genealogy of your own work that part or that aspect of yours that does seek some sublimation to Freud, which is precisely Rosenzweig and precisely that kind of notion of being in the midst of life. And so the question is if I'm on track, and I would just sort of suggest that I think in many ways right now in your element you are. I mean, that's this unpreparedness that Simon speaks to is your way of really being in the midst of life as you think out loud. That would be...
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's very funny. Years ago I taught a brief summer seminar at the University of Konstanz, and on Rilke. But then on the side, I did a one-day workshop with Jan Assmann, the great Egyptologist, on Freud's on Moses and monotheism, a book about which he had written, I think, some very strange things. And so it was a special, seminar. It was a beautiful room, and it went on for a few hours. At the end of the seminar, Jan said to me, "It sort of feels like you just thought of these things for the first time." And I said, I might have. I'm not sure. I know I thought of it, but I think it was like I just thought of them. And it also makes me remember, I had a wonderful teacher at the University of Texas, Louis Mackey, who was a Kierkegaard. I mean, he started in doing medieval philosophy, and then he got very into Kierkegaard, wrote a book, Kierkegaard, a Kind of Poet, and then got very into Derrida and postmodern American fiction and punk rock. And yet he was this a very observant Protestant who went to church every Sunday. And he said at the end of every semester, he throws away his notes. Even though he's going to teach the same class, he just throws it all away.
The Louis C.K. of teaching.
Yeah, the Louis Mackey, the Louis C.K. Yeah. And there's something to be said for that. And so I do think that it's the hardest thing about thinking, I think, is, I could tell you that, before coming, we were on vacation, Pam and I we spent a week in Istria. We spent a lot of the summer doing very mundane, we sold our little cottage in Michigan. It's basically really nothing strongly intellectual. And then we were away, and I started thinking, oh God, I got to get back in shape. I got to start thinking. And so the last few days, I was kind of rereading things, and I said, did I say that? And I thought, that's pretty good. And I thought, well, I can't keep up with it. I don't know how did he come up with that? And I then got very anxious, and started trying to copy and paste notes. I started preparing a series of notes. In fact, I had trouble using Word on my iPad. So in the middle of the night, I called Humanities Computing in Chicago. I tried to call Microsoft to say, I didn't know how to cut and paste because I was so anxious about having something to say. And then at a certain point,
Took an Ambien.
I didn't take an Ambien. Last night I took an Ambien. But at a certain point, and so it's very defensive. And that's how when I started teaching, in fact, when I started teaching at Princeton, I was terrified before every class. And really would have to do deep breathing in my office before going to class, and wanted to write everything out. And that was always a disaster. And it took, though, many, many years to learn how to be underprepared. It's very hard to be underprepared,
I still haven't learned.
It's hard. No, I remember when...
I know, this is obsessional, sorry.
When we talked about teaching, together the first time, Mladen said, okay, so... I think you want to basically give a paper. It's like, speak for an hour. I said, isn't that, you speak and then you speak and then, I said, no, let's just, let's just start. And we eventually found this really wonderful rhythm. And I think, to me, that's another, the seminar became for me a way of being in the midst of life. And so pedagogy became a site for me of a kind of practice. And so it's maybe a wretched kind of practice, but nonetheless a practice,
No, the seminars we taught together were actually also for me extremely formative and the highlights really of my pedagogical career. It was really extraordinary. To do this. We did this, I think, four times so far, but it was. And there's another seminar attendant, actually, of ours.
First, thanks Mladen and Eric for this really generative and rich and punny conversation. On this last point, just a brief comment on this sort of last point, because you kind of ended, Eric, with gesturing toward Fred Moten and the Black radical tradition and poetry, and just the conversation you were just having makes me think about how jazz is so important, and improvisation is so important to that tradition, right? Amiri Baraka, Fred Moten, all of these figures, right? And maybe this is something that we should also embrace and think about, a sort of revolutionary potential in improvisation, in particular in free jazz, I would say. So that comment, but what I really wanted to ask, and this is kind of, this just came to me tonight, so it's not there's not much flesh on the bone. But I wanted to come back to the sort of impasse of the general strike, right? And it occurs to me that the pandemic lockdown was a sort of general strike, but enforced by the government, right? There was a kind of messianic cessation of happening, as Benjamin put it, right? But it's a kind of general strike in the negative in a certain way, right? Because it's not the workers refusing to work, but the government telling them that they can't work. And what you actually had was the workers out demonstrating on the streets because they wanted to go back to work, right? Whereas in a strike, you'll be on the streets not working and seeking, public support for that, right? So you have this weird kind of inversion of a strike, I think, of a kind of general strike in the pandemic. And I'm just wondering if you think there's something to think about there, right? Like why, maybe in, so I mean, in a certain sense, all the workers had to do is not go back to work, right? They already were on a general strike, just don't go back. But of course, they want to go back, and maybe this is the kind of, religious aspect of work. So yeah, I don't know. I just wanted to throw that out there. It's like, is there material there to think with about the general strike and why it doesn't work with the pandemic, or why it hasn't worked hitherto, right?
Yeah.
I will just add that during the pandemic I wrote a piece using Benjamin actually, but another thing, the dialectic in Stillstand, the standstill of dialectics. So I think there was the whole lockdown, there was a lot of standstill, no dialectics. This was the trouble of the lockdown. Sorry, this is just a...
Also, it's the people who actually needed to go on strike were the so-called emergency workers who had to work.
Yes.
The lowest paid workers actually had to work.
Yes, that's
and were most endangered, most exposed to the virus, most, least protected. And so it was a highly uneven strike. But it did, for whatever, we don't know what the outcome will be, but it has generated a lot of thought and reflection about work, what work is. Not just about, quiet quitting, or Zoom, just work by way of Zoom, but just the whole question of what work and what the office is.
Yes.
And what is it? What do we actually do there?
Yeah.
And what is, so I think it has, I wouldn't say the lockdown was a general strike, but it has been generative in some ways of new thinking about the nature of work and how we might reimagine work, and also shared responsibilities, shared, and certainly rethinking healthcare.
Yes.
And so there's a lot that has come out of it, and it's not clear that something will really grow, but there are things, let's say the possibility of new possibilities happen.
Well, also, I mean, just the strikes at Starbucks and Amazon, right?
Yeah.
I feel like those would not have been possible if it weren't for, somehow, if it weren't for the pandemic, right? That there was a kind of realization of, like these, Amazon workers who are in this sort of extremely precarious position and working for, the wealthiest company in the world, and
just that maybe the notion of the essential worker itself has
Right.
a certain kind of power in it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, not our heroes, you know,
Yeah,
like,
yeah, yeah.
heroes work here. I mean, I saw this sign every, you know, heroes work here.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
We have overpassed the time greatly,
Too little
manifold
time,
times.
too much time.
This is like by twice. Simon, you wanted to say something before? No, okay. I think this is a point at which we must really stop. And thank you so much, Eric.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much
Thank you.
for the book, for this talk, for summarizing it, really wrapping it up in such a beautiful way.